Welcome to October's Tudor Travel Show. It's lovely to be here with you folks. Have you been on any Tudor road trips recently? Well, I love to hear about it if you have, and I have been receiving some lovely emails from folks of late saying how much they've been enjoying the show, and also the Tudor Travel Guide mini guides, which are in the Tudor Travel Guide shop. Inspiring people to go and explore new places and find out new things. So that is wonderful, and thank you very much to all those people who have contacted me. Now, this week's Tudor Travel Show is action-packed. I start by heading off to Great Bedwyn Church and Wolfhall in Wiltshire, where I'm in conversation with historian Graham Bathe, who's an expert on the Seymours and Wolfhall. And we start off by discussing some very interesting new research which has come to light around Sir John Seymour, Jane Seymour's father. And I must say it does answer a few questions that I've had over the years about the relationship between father and daughter. So stay tuned for that. I also go down the road to a very rainy Wolfhall, where I catch up with what has been going on in the second year of the archaeological digs which have been going on to try and uncover the original Tudor mansion. So find out what has been going on and what the team have been learning about Jane Seymour's childhood home. Now, of course, we're going to do our usual visit to the Tudor Travel Guide news desk, and continuing our theme of the Seymours, we'll be travelling to Hampton Court to join in the celebrations at the birth of the new Prince Edward. And finally, I'm in conversation with Charlotte Bolland. Now, Charlotte Bolland is the senior curator for 16th century collections at the National Portrait Gallery. And you may be aware that there has been a recent acquisition there of a portrait of Jane Seymour. And I go in conversation with Charlotte to find out all about the secret life of this really fascinating painting. I was blown away by just how much information you can get from one single painting. Anyway, before we start, I wanted to make a very important announcement. So from the 24th of October, for 4 days, Natalie Grueniger from On the Tudor Trail and I, co-authors of the In the Footsteps books, will be running a 4-day virtual progress. Now, this progress is part of the 1535 progress undertaken by Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, a progress that we write about in full in the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn. But we wanted to bring you your own very special Tudor adventure, and so we have recorded a series of online videos of Natalie and I in discussion about the progress, the context of the progress, which was explosive, I can tell you, as well as doing a deep dive into the locations that they stayed during their progress through Gloucestershire. So we will be visiting Sudeley Castle, Tewkesbury Abbey, Gloucester Abbey and its immediate surroundings, Leonard Stanley, Berkeley Castle and Thornbury Castle, and we'll be recreating these places as they looked during the visit and finding out just what took place there. It's a wonderful conversation and I hope that you'll be able to join us. I have put a link in the introductory text for this episode on Podbean, which will take you directly through to the place where you can sign up and reserve your seat. So make sure you don't miss out. We're starting on the 24th of October and we'll be running on 4 consecutive days, finishing on the 27th. If you've got any questions, obviously just feel free to email me at sarah@thetudortravelguide.com. Well, with that, I think we are ready to dive into today's episode. So let's head over straight away where I met up with Graham Bathe, historian, inside Great Bedwyn Church, which is in Wiltshire and not far from Wolfhall. And here we are in discussion, standing next to the tomb of Sir John Seymour, Jane Seymour's father, and I am dying to find out why Graham Bathe has insisted that we meet there. So welcome to, well, here we are actually in Great Bedwyn Church, close to Wolfhall, and I'm standing here with a true expert on the real Wolfhall. Graham, welcome to the show today.
Pleased to see you.
Now, before maybe we get into why exactly we're here in Great Bedwyn Church, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your involvement with Wolfhall over the years and the kind of projects that you've been involved with.
Yes, well, it started really because I was studying Savernake Forest, and I've been studying Savernake Forest now for about 20 years. But Savernake, as indeed all the land around here, has been in the hands of a single family for most of its history. So Savernake has been in the hands of the Seymours or their ancestors since 1086. Right. So it was from studying Savernake that I became interested in the Seymours, and through that Wolfhall and other properties that the Seymours owned.
Okay, and of course we're going to be going to Wolfhall shortly, and you've been involved with an archaeological dig there, haven't you, over the last couple of years?
Yes, that's right. For the last 2 or 3 years we've been very lucky that the owners of Wolfhall have permitted us to do an archaeological dig and dig up most of their garden. Extremely lucky.
It's very generous of them. But when I contacted you to say I'd love to come, because I obviously came to Wolfhall last year to see you at the end of the first year's dig, and I wanted to come back and see what you'd been up to and see what you'd found. You said, hey, well, Sarah, maybe we need to talk about something else. Why don't we meet at Sir John's tomb in Great Bedwyn Church? And that's exactly where we are now. We're standing close to the high altar. Right next to, on my right-hand side here, is the rather fabulous stone tomb.
Yes, this is actually a later tomb. It's an Elizabethan tomb, so it wasn't constructed until about 50 years after he died.
I see. So first of all, tell me why are we here? Obviously, Sir John owned Wolfhall, but there's some interesting research you've been doing about him.
That's right. Well, it is a very spectacular tomb that we have here, with this fine effigy of a knight, and he's got his head on a helmet with the Seymour wings attached to it. And we've got a plaque just above it which says, this knight departed this life at the age of 60 in December 1536. Mm-hmm. And that has been quoted so many times in so many books for hundreds of years. Nobody's ever actually questioned that, because we have an actual record on a tomb. And of course, you wouldn't expect a tomb to be wrong concerning the date of somebody's death. No. It might be wrong concerning the date of their birth, but not the date of their death. Anyway, I have a very good friend at Oxford, Ian Purvis, who noticed that Sir John's son, Edward Seymour, seemed to be arranging his land in certain ways before, as far as we knew, he had inherited it. And that raised the prospect that perhaps Sir John had not died at the same date as shown on his tomb. Mm. Now, for a long time, this is the date of his death has generated some problems, because we know that his daughter Jane Seymour didn't go to his funeral in December 1536. Mm.
Which was held where, by the way?
It was held at Easton Priory, or at least he was buried at Easton Priory, and you would have expected that the funeral of the Queen's father would have been a massive affair.
Indeed, yes.
But as far as we can tell, Jane didn't attend. In fact, instead she was at pageants, various pageants in London at the time.
May I interrupt? Was the courts, because obviously we were in the run-up to Christmas at that time, was the court seemingly carrying on as normal with the usual kind of activities and feasting and hunting and hawking, etc.?
It was completely as normal. In fact, there were massive pageants in London which Jane took part in. And as far as we can tell, there was no obvious communication between Jane Seymour and the rest of her family. You would have thought we may have been in an era where perhaps women didn't attend funerals, but you would have expected her to have wanted to comfort her own mother at that time. But Jane didn't attend the funeral. The other thing that was interesting and has caused a lot of confusion, or a lot of speculation really, is the fact that Sir John Seymour received no benefits, no honours and no land at the time that his daughter Jane married the king. And under normal circumstances, you would have expected the king to bestow some sort of significant favour on his wife's father.
You certainly saw that with Anne Boleyn, who preceded Jane.
Absolutely substantial. And yet Sir John got absolutely nothing. And this has raised speculation that perhaps he disapproved of the marriage, or that the two men hated each other. But recently we've discovered, in fact, he didn't die in 1536 at all. He died in 1535. And we don't know the origin of the error. But of course, the tomb was created a long time after he died. And it may be something just as simple as a monumental mason reading a 5 as a 6. And it's so simple. It's been written down, a 5 as a 6. And with that, all the problems that we've had have suddenly been dissipated.
Of course.
Jane didn't attend the funeral because that's not when it occurred. Sir John didn't receive any lands or any titles because he was already dead. He died, in fact, before his daughter married the king.
How did you, I mean, obviously you were looking for it because there were all these questions that were coming up. How did you make the discovery? Where did you actually find the missing link?
The categorical proof came when we discovered that in January 1536, Sir John's son, that's Edward Seymour, he applied to the Archbishop of Canterbury for special dispensation to administer his father's land, who had died intestate. So the last time that we know Sir John was alive was in November 1535. He was certainly dead by the 5th of January 1536. So the likelihood is the date, the 21st of December, is correct, but the year is wrong. And we found a lot of corroborative evidence since that they were selling off there was an inventory of goods and selling off the goods that he owned. So there is a lot of evidence. And suddenly the solution is very, very simple. We've also got a solution to a problem which has worried me for some time, because this tomb says that he was buried first of all in the Priory Church at Easton. We now call it Easton Royal.
And where is that for people who are not familiar?
It's very close to here. It's just about 3 or 4 miles away. So it's also quite close to Wolfhall, and it was the traditional site of burials of the Seymours and their predecessors, the Estermys. But at the date given there, December 1536, the priory had already been dissolved in the Reformation. And it would have been bizarre to have referred to it as a priory church at that time.
Yes,
But of course, if it had died the year before, it makes complete sense.
So when was the priory dissolved? What's the date?
It was dissolved in about June 1536.
I see.
So it all ties in perfectly.
Yes, all of those questions solved. I must admit, for a long time, I was also wondering, why didn't Sir John, be made an earl just as Thomas Boleyn was? So now we all know the answer to that.
We do, and his son actually benefited significantly because his son got that's Jane's brother,
yes,
got the title and the lands that perhaps his father would have got.
Yes, indeed, yes. So looking at this tomb here, I also noticed that there's some rather spectacular glass in the window that's above the tomb, and that's quite special as well, isn't it? What can you tell us about that?
Well, this is glass that was discovered at Wolfhall in 1881, stained glass, and it was brought here and erected in 1905, and in fact to install the glass here, the tomb had to be altered, it had to be brought out from the wall and new windows created. And these windows show the badge of Jane Seymour, which is a phoenix rising from a castle. It shows the Prince of Wales' feathers, which is a reference to Jane's son,
Edward, yes.
Edward VI. We've also got a Tudor rose there, and it's all mounted by the King's crown.
Do we have any idea where this glass was found at Wolfhall, or how it was found? Because I mean, you know, it's not just a fragment, is it? It's the full heraldic symbols, the full heraldic emblems. So quite substantial pieces of glass. Were they just in a window already, and they were moved here for safekeeping?
They were already mounted at Wolfhall, but I think there are problems, at least with parts of the glass, because as you say, the emblems are full heraldic emblems, and to my mind they are a little bit too intact, right, for us to trust them totally. Now my suspicion is, and it's not proven, my suspicion is that the true Tudor glass from Wolfhall is what constitutes the roundels there, where we can see that they don't match. There's no symmetry there, and we've got little pieces, little fragments of glass which have been arranged to make like a frame, and the central emblems, I suspect, are much later.
I see. Oh, what a shame. Because they are rather spectacular, aren't they?
They are still spectacular, and they do actually resemble another chapel which is in Leicestershire, where nobody has doubted that they are original. So there is still a big question mark there.
How do you tell if glass is original? What kind of tests? I mean, for wood, you would do dendrochronology. What kind of testing could you do for glass?
You would look very closely at the quality of the glass, and to some extent we can see it here. If it was Tudor glass, it's going to be very poor and completely covered in bubbles. Well, it isn't, quite frankly. It looks fairly pristine, and yes, it's got breaks across it, but it seems to me those breaks are almost strategic. You know, they have been positioned so they don't spoil the picture underneath.
I see. Now, as I said, we are going to actually be going over to Wolfhall and having a look at the trenches you've been digging. But since we're talking about glass, I understand that actually you have unearthed a beautiful piece of original painted glass from Wolfhall.
We do. Just over here, we've got this spectacular piece of glass, which we found at Wolfhall, and is perhaps one of our greatest treasures.
Yes, I'm holding it in my hand. So it's a fragment about the size of the palm of my hand, maybe a little bit larger than that. And can you just describe what we can see on it?
Yes, one of the interesting things you can immediately see about this is that it has been shaped by nibbling, because it's a sort of teardrop shape. And it's been shaped by nibbling the little edges. It's called grozing, G-R-O-Z, grozing. It hasn't been cut by diamond, and diamond cutting came in about 1550, something like that. So it's going to be before 1550, which is what we would have expected anyway. The other thing is that this is painted glass. The glass itself is cobalt. Cobalt glass of that shade came in about 1520, so we would expect it now to be between 1520 and 1550. Wow. And when you hold it up to the light, you've got this wonderful shade of blue coming through.
Ah, yes.
But in the...
I can see that beautifully.
That's the translucent light, but in the transcendent light, you see the painting of these like acanthus leaves. And this is extremely high quality. Obviously, we don't know who did it, but it is of the quality of the king's glazier at the time, who was Gallion Hone, and all the top quality stained glass glaziers came from the Netherlands or the Low Countries.
I've got quite a vivid imagination, but I can already see a room growing around this piece of glass, and how wonderful to see the dappled light coming through, maybe onto some kind of gallery
Yes, it would be so fantastic, wouldn't it, to find the other bits and to reconstruct a window. We can't say for this piece of glass that it looks identical to any of the others that we have mounted in the church here. But we do know that Sir Edward Seymour in particular, he mounted his coats of arms in stained glass everywhere he went. So there are probably significant other parts yet to be found.
I was going to say, maybe you'll find them. So with that, I think that would be a really great time for us to just pause while we head on over to Wolfhall and have a look at what you've been digging.
Let's go.
So we've come just about 2 to 3 miles down the road from Great Bedwyn Church, and Graham and I are now standing in the grounds of the current Wolfhall, which of course was the site of the original Tudor building. And in fact, there has been an excavation project ongoing now for 2 years here to try and find more about that original house. So Graham, perhaps you could, before we get into the details of what you've been finding this year, perhaps you could just tell our listeners, what the purpose of the project is and maybe what the first year unearthed.
Yes, indeed. Well, what we're trying to do here is to reconstruct, at least in our minds figuratively, what Wolfhall looked like at various stages through history. And we know that there was a very substantial building here in medieval times, in particular in the 14th century. It belonged to Sir William of Sturmey, who was a very eminent man, ambassador to Rome, Speaker of the House of Commons. He was elected to the Shire on 12 occasions. So this very eminent man built a stone mason-built building here. And then in Tudor times it was massively upgraded. In fact, to some extent we may have found the date of the upgrading because we've unearthed a record of when Sir John Seymour of Wolfhall was having a battle with the Prior of Easton, and the priory accused Sir John of having stolen 12 ash trees to build his scaffolding here at Wolfhall, and that is 1531, and that gives us a very plausible date for the upgrading of Wolfhall.
Well, that's fascinating because, I mean, the 1530s, everything is happening in the 1530s with Anne Boleyn obviously marrying Henry VIII, and then, of course, later on in the decade, Jane Seymour comes into the picture. But so you wanted to try and understand what the original hall looked like, that original Tudor hall, and you started your dig last year. So what did you manage to do last year, and what do you think you found as a result?
Yes, well, indeed. Well, last year we were in particular following a wall along, which you can see along that part of the garden there. Most of it now has been filled in, but we've got these massive medieval stone foundations onto which brick has been inserted. So we've got an original medieval wall there, and it would have been massive. It is so wide, it's capable of holding 3 stories. And further along we had a hexagonal tower which was proud of the wall, and we found another octagonal protuberance here, like a bay window or turret. And that's more or less where we left it last year. And we thought, well, it's going to carry on and probably go beyond the garden. And we started excavating again this year, and were rather surprised to find, in fact, that we've got a corner, and that it turned a corner abruptly where we're standing now.
Yes,
And
I should just say, actually, we are in the trenches right at the moment. So we're in the corner of the garden at Wolfhall, in the trenches, and I'm looking at as you say, a sort of an angle in the wall here, and I'm actually standing on one aspect of the wall. So what did that tell you, this angle piece here?
well, it's to some extent it has thrown us, but it's led us to wonder whether, in fact, Wolfhall the original Tudor Wolfhall actually did face north, as the current Wolfhall faces. Because it doesn't seem to have the symmetry that perhaps we were expecting. And what we do know is that there is a massive red deer park adjoining, called Sudden Park or Sudeen Park, and that was built at the same time that Tudor Wolfhall was upgrading using the new fashionable brick. So when brick was brought in here, it was absolutely new, and we can be certain that the person who was designing Wolfhall at that time was intimately familiar with what was happening in London with Hampton Court and other palaces.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so that was last year's dig, and you've obviously this year you've found this turn, and you're now beginning to wonder whether the house was orientated in a completely different direction.
Yes, exactly, a completely different direction, 180 degrees different direction. So that has thrown us. I mean, what we can see here is that we have reached the outside of the house, because I don't know whether you can see, but we've got a cobbled surface outside.
Oh, I see,
so,
yes.
So it's a flint cobbled surface, and although most of it is white, some of the flints have been struck off to make them black, and they make like a diagonal pattern, a large diagonal pattern. So there would have been a massive courtyard area here.
Just outside.
Outside, which could have taken horse traffic.
I see.
So we're definitely at the end of a building here, the end of the major construction. Now the place where we're standing certainly had rooms within it, and we found some more tiles. We'd found various tiles last year which were Tudor, a few which were a little bit earlier, but we found a tile here which was actually in situ, so it hasn't been it's not part of the rubble, and that tile is otherwise only found at Clarendon Palace, just outside Salisbury, from about 1230, where it was made. So that does in fact suggest that Wolfhall was already a very prominent building, perhaps earlier than we thought. By the 1200s it was already a very wealthy, eminent construction.
So does that mean then that it's likely that the original medieval hall wasn't destroyed, it was more upgraded by Jane Seymour's father when he did those renovations?
That's absolutely correct, that some of the original medieval building would have been retained, some were upgraded in the new fashionable brick, there were extensions, and a complete new sewer system was put in underneath. But of course it couldn't necessarily be simplified and go directly where people may have wanted it to go, because of all the massive stone foundations which are still here.
And the sewer system I got to see last year, and actually you can still get down into them, can't you? They're really, really finely preserved.
It is absolutely remarkable. They may be the most intact set of Tudor sewers in the country. There's about 100 metres or so, and they form quite a complex network. Now there is a lot of work yet to do with the sewers, because where you've got the garderobes, that is the toilet drops into the sewers, those would have been placed on the outside of a wall. Often where they were placed, they were also incorporated with chimneys. So by aligning those garderobes we can see that we've got a north-south alignment of the garderobes, and these walls that we see here are also north-south aligned, and indeed the current Wolfhall is still retained on a north-south alignment.
So anything else that you've unearthed during this year that you found particularly interesting?
Well, we've found a lot of finds. I mean, in terms of the total number of finds from the site, we are now in the thousands, literally thousands.
Oh, really? Right.
We found 6,500 oyster shells alone, and many thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of animal bones, a lot of clothing fastenings, metal clothing fastenings. But some of the things that we found this year here at this location were a number of jetons, and jetons are counters which were used in order to help do calculations with Roman numerals. If you try and add up Roman numerals, or worse, multiply Roman numerals, it is an absolute nightmare. So what people had were jetons. They're like discs, they're like casino chips, I suppose, and you could have those on a board, and that board was called a counter, and that is why we still use the term counter in a shop today.
I see.
And by moving these around, you could do the calculations, and we found a number of jetons all here.
So you're holding one in your hand here, aren't you? Can I try and have a look at that? It's
Yes,
just in a little
these
plastic bag to
these
protect it.
jetons were actually made in Germany. This is a Nuremberg jeton of somebody called Hans Krauwinkel. Hans Krauwinkel
Well, there's
II.
a name. There's a name to contend with.
He should be playing Widow Twankey at the Hackney Empire, I think. And so if I just get this jeton now and put it in your hand.
I'm holding it in my hand. I mean, it looks a lot like a coin. So how do you know that it's a jeton and not a coin?
Well, these jetons were in fact made and used all over Europe, so they're fairly commonplace,
Right.
for doing these calculations. And yes, they are. They can be identified, and they can be.
So there's a
dated.
kind of, yeah, so they're well known, well documented.
They're well known, well documented.
Yes, I see.
And this particular style is well documented. And the fact that it's made in Germany, because it has no cash value, it doesn't actually matter where they were manufactured.
I see. So it's amazing there to be holding that in my hand and think that at some point somebody in a Wolfhall was sitting at a table doing their calculations.
Yes, it
pieces.
makes us wonder, in fact, whether this could have been the treasury. To have found so many together. We know that Wolfhall had a treasury, and we could be in the counting house.
Wow, well, there you go. So what happens from here? Are you planning to extend the dig? What are the future plans for this?
Yes, we're reaching the end of this year's dig, and as you can tell from the weather that it becomes increasingly difficult to work in conditions like this. So to protect the dig, we will be filling it in at the end of the year, and then we've got to have a plan of campaign for next year. At the moment, as you can see, we've got a very platformed area, and it looks like probably all of this had some sort of building or was within a courtyard.
I see. So really, we're looking now across the garden. We've got the existing farmhouse of Wolfhall over to the left here, and in front of us we've got an extensive lawn, which, as you say, is quite flat. So you're thinking that will be building or courtyard? What's your current hypothesis on that, Graham?
Well, we have, through using geophys, we have found what appears to be a wall going east-west in the front of the current house. Another thing that we're really keen to try and find is a mechanism for flushing the sewers, because one of the bizarre things about Wolfhall, despite the fact it's been occupied, we know it's been occupied for over 1,000 years, there is no water here. You wouldn't believe that on a day like this, but even the current occupants get their water from a well which is about 100 foot deep.
I see.
So how would they have flushed out the sewers? Yes, you can send boys down to sweep them out, but they would have needed to be flushed. And so we're wondering whether in fact there is a mechanism, perhaps at the end of the garden there. When we had an open day here, we had various people who called by fairly elderly people who said that when they were young, the ground opened up there and there seemed to be a tunnel.
I see. Mm-hmm.
Now, initially, I was quite dismissive of that because there are a lot of sort of fanciful tales told about Wolfhall. But then, by the end of the day, about 5 people had said exactly the same thing. And that was the time to be humble and recognise, no, that may be perhaps the source of the water, which would have flushed the water through the sewers.
So you're going to cover up this year's dig and then return next year to continue?
We have plans to continue next year, and who knows what the year will hold.
Oh dear. So what's your big hypothesis for next year, or what would you be trying to test then? About the sewers and the drainage of the sewers, for one thing. Anything else about the house itself?
Well, the actual layout of the house, we have no contemporary record of or description of the house, and most of our records have to come, as we talked about before, Sarah, when we have accounts of when workmen are brought in to repair tiles or repair windows. Because of that, we know this house was absolutely massive, and we also know that it entertained hundreds, literally hundreds of people to meals here. So it must have been absolutely gigantic. At the moment, yes, it looks grand, but we must have found only about 5 or 10% of the total area that there would have been here.
So there's lots to go at. And am I right in saying that there may be an open day next year for people who might want to come along and have a look at what you're doing?
That's right. We have plans to have an open day subject to the owner's agreement in the summer of next year, when anybody will be welcome.
That's something to look forward to. And I must also point out that you have a website, don't you, the Friends of Wolfhall?
The Friends of Wolfhall, if you just Google Friends of Wolfhall or the real Wolfhall, you'll come across the website.
And people can donate and support the development and the care for this site, can't they?
Indeed, you can keep up to date and receive newsletters, and if anybody wishes to donate, they would be very welcome to indeed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for joining me on what is being, and I'm sure our listeners can hear the pitter-patter, a very, very rainy, wet October day here. But thank you so much for joining us on the show
You're
today.
very welcome.
So that was me in conversation with Graham Bathe, first at Great Bedwyn Church and latterly at a very rainy Wolfhall. It's such an atmospheric place, even though the Tudor Manor House no longer exists, or very, very little exists. And so if you have any chance at all, I do recommend that you keep your eyes peeled for that open day next year and see if you can get along there for yourself. Well, as usual now, it's time for a change of pace, and we're going to be going over to the TTG news desk and to our news presenter Robert Cole to see exactly what has been breaking in the Tudor month of October.
Welcome to the October O'Clock News with your newsreader, Robert Cole. Here are the Tudor headlines for the month. Prince Edward is born at Hampton Court Palace. Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England, is crowned at Westminster Abbey. Thomas More becomes Chancellor of England. And Margaret Tudor dies at Methven Castle, Scotland, aged 52. Good day. There is great rejoicing across the country today as news spread of the birth of a new Tudor prince. At 2 a.m. yesterday morning, the 12th of October, Her Grace, Queen Jane, gave birth to a son in the Queen's privy chambers at Hampton Court Palace. Both the Queen and the little prince, who is to be called Prince Edward after the saint's day upon which he was born, are said to be doing well and in good health. Of course, the arrival of the boy sees an end to King Henry VIII's long wait for a healthy son and heir. Sources close to the king within the king's privy chamber report that His Majesty is jubilant and that plans are already underway for a magnificent christening. This looks set to take place at Hampton Court Palace in a few days' time. And so to hear just what has been happening, we're going over now to our roving reporter Catherine Simmons, who is waiting to talk to us just outside a very boisterous St Paul's Cathedral, where a great service of celebration has just concluded. So Catherine, what can you tell us about how the news was first announced?
Well, yes, hello, Robert. I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to hear me over all the celebrations going on with me here. But yes, according to royal protocol, shortly after the safe delivery of the new prince, we understand that the Queen wrote immediately to the King's principal secretary, Thomas Cromwell, officially announcing the delivery of a son, who was, and I quote, conceived in lawful matrimony.
There were some difficulties with the delivery, weren't there? Do we know how long the Queen was in labour in the end?
Sorry, Robert, there are quite a lot of boisterous folk hanging around at the moment. But to answer your question, yes, we understand through one of the Queen's ladies that Her Majesty endured a very hard labour, which she bore with exceeding pain for over 2 whole days.
Yeah.
As many people living in London will be aware, there was a most solemn procession yesterday of both religious and civic brethren of the city to pray for the Queen's life and that of her unborn child. Thanks be to God, Prince Edward was born in the small hours of yesterday morning, Friday, the 12th of October. As you say, Robert, both are said to be doing well.
My, but it is boisterous there. And what about the christening? We hear it is to take place within the next few days at Hampton Court.
Yes, that is absolutely right. Plans are already well underway for a great celebratory christening over at the palace. Although the King already has an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, the Duke of Richmond, the new prince is the King's lawful heir, and after 28 years of waiting, I suspect this is going to be some party with absolutely no expense spared.
Do we know any of the details?
Not all, but my sources tell me that the prince will be taken from the royal apartments in procession through the Great Hall, through the courtyard, and to the Chapel Royal, where he will be christened by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Several of the most aristocrat nobles in the land, including the new prince's half-sister, Mary, are said to be standing as godparents, with the 4-year-old Lady Elizabeth, the King's second daughter, also in attendance. There are concerns, though, as the plague is rife in London at the moment. Proclamations have already been issued by the Privy Council to forbid any person not specifically invited by the King to attend the christening to come to Hampton Court. And in fact, to limit exposure and risk of disease, overall numbers are being carefully controlled. It has been made clear that anyone who has been exposed to the plague in their households, be they well or no, are forbidden to access the palace.
So what is happening now?
Well, as you can hear, and we've already said, I am surrounded by great crowds making merry. People are singing and dancing, and music can be heard almost everywhere you go as you make your way through the city. You mentioned earlier that a celebratory mass has just been conducted inside St Paul's. The congregation are now emerging, and I have already seen the Lord Chancellor, Lord Privy Seal, the Marquess of Dorset, and the French ambassador amongst them. You can perhaps also hear the peal of guns being fired from the tower. And it is expected that the church bells across London will continue to ring until well after dark. Fires are due to be lit at dusk on every street corner, and I suspect this party will go on well into the night.
And when do we expect the Queen will rejoin the court?
As you know, according to the protocol, the Queen will remain in purdah within the Queen's Privy Chambers at Hampton Court for another 4 to 6 weeks. After that time, she will be churched and rejoin the court. So we should be seeing her again by early December. I suspect this is going to be a very happy Christmas in the royal household.
Well, it's surely the most joyful news that has come to England these many years, and it does sound like everybody is celebrating. So thank you, Catherine, for that report on the new royal birth. And that concludes the October O'Clock news. All that remains for me to say is that the TTG News Desk will return in November. But for now, it's back to the 21st century.
It's funny, isn't it? We're so used to looking back at Tudor history when we know exactly what's going to happen next. But of course, you get a very different point of view when you're actually in it and history is unfolding. Anyway, we're going to continue on the theme of Jane Seymour now, because recently online I noticed that the National Portrait Gallery had acquired a new portrait of Jane Seymour, and of course my curiosity was piqued. I wanted to know more, and particularly having spoken to museum curators and gallery curators in the past, I knew that quite often there is a really fascinating story behind these paintings. So I made contact with Charlotte Bolland, who's senior curator for the 16th century collections at the gallery, and now you will find us in conversation about what turns out to be a completely fascinating story wrapped around this newly acquired portrait. So welcome, Charlotte, to the Tudor Travel Show.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm really excited to talk to you today because I, and I'm sure many other of my listeners, saw recently that there was a very interesting Tudor painting came to the National Portrait Gallery, and I thought straight away how wonderful it would be to talk to you about that painting, which of course is of Jane Seymour.
Yes, but portrait acquisitions in the 16th century, which is the area of the National Portrait Gallery's collection that I'm responsible for, are kind of somewhat few and far between. So it was a very exciting moment. And when the opportunity arose for us to acquire a portrait of Jane Seymour, that it was something that we really wanted to kind of seize upon.
I bet you did. But before we get into that, it might be appropriate just for you to introduce yourself to everyone, and particularly what you do and what your job entails, because I'm sure people are very interested.
So I am senior curator with responsibilities for research and the 16th century collections at the National Portrait Gallery. And so as 16th century curator, I look after the acquisition of works for the collection and research those, and then also I'm responsible for the displays in London in rooms 1 to 3, and then with a partnership that we have with the National Trust at Montacute House in Somerset, that we have a number of Tudor and Jacobean portraits on display there. And then also just sort of general research into 16th century portraiture more broadly. So lots of exciting partnerships with other collections to really try and learn more about what I think is an incredibly interesting and relatively unstudied area of British art.
How interesting. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are very envious of just how interesting your job sounds, and the chance to get up close and personal with these amazing works of art. So let's talk a little bit about the painting. As I mentioned, the subject is Jane Seymour. What I'm going to do is I will do a short blog with a picture of the an image of the aforementioned picture, so people can look at the image as we're talking. But maybe you could just describe it for us.
Well, yes, so it's a three-quarter portrait of a woman facing to the left, and she's got this very elaborate green and gold curtain behind her that is kind of swept up into a knot in the top right-hand corner, that she's got her hands clasped in front of her quite sort of demurely and is looking off into the distance. She doesn't engage out with the viewer. She's wearing this very beautiful red velvet dress, and then an English gable hood that's folded up in the style that was fashionable in the sort of 1530s. And it does have some quite unusual qualities when you first see it, because there are areas that seem not to have been finished. So her jewels, which you can see where the sort of positions of where they should be, instead of being kind of sparkling and detailed, they're actually just these sort of rust-coloured blobs of paint, which is very interesting. And then also her sleeves, where you would expect there to be, again, a very kind of rich pattern, perhaps of a cloth of silver, is just a very plain sort of off-white colour. So it's clear from sort of first impressions with the painting that it's someone of great status, a very kind of lavish commission, but that perhaps has an unusual element to it.
And she's quite unmistakably Jane Seymour. I think we've all seen other portraits of her. I don't think the question of the sitter was ever in any doubt, was it?
Well, that's the wonderful thing, yes, about Jane Seymour, because we have the two kind of most famous portraits of her being done by the German artist Hans Holbein the Younger, which survive as a portrait drawing in the Royal Collection amongst his whole collection of patterns for physiognomies, and then a painting of Jane Seymour that's in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And these are two of, I would say, almost the most kind of iconic 16th century portraits produced in England. And so she's very recognisable. And what we were able to ascertain very quickly is that this portrait is on exactly the same scale as the Vienna portrait. So everything is in kind of the same position. And that was what made us, as the gallery, so particularly interested in this portrait, because she's very recognisable as Jane Seymour.
Okay, now I'm always interested in the provenance of paintings and how do they survive. You know, we've lost so many paintings, but yet some of them survive. So what do we know of the provenance, and how did you acquire it for the gallery?
Well, we were able to acquire the painting at auction. And in a way that is actually very common to lots of surviving 16th century portraits, we don't have a full provenance for the work. In a way, the Holbein drawings at the Royal Collection are this wonderful anomaly because you can actually trace them through the Royal provenance. Whereas for most of the works that we have in the National Portrait Gallery's collection, there's a sort of grey area in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And so this is the case here, that from the owners who were selling it at auction, it had belonged to their parents and had just hung in their house. That there is of bits of information that you always kind of look for on the back of the painting. This has a slight clue of a label that suggests it was a collection in St James's, London, in the late 19th century. But that's as far back as we've been able to go so far. We'll always keep looking.
I bet. I just think it's fascinating. I really do. So you bought the painting. You knew it was a 16th century painting, or was there any question about the date of it?
No, we were lucky that we were able to kind of be fairly secure in dating of the kind of core element of the portrait, because the auctioneers had commissioned dendrochronological analysis of the wooden panel support before the sale, which identified that the tree was felled in the 1530s. So we knew that it was therefore kind of a plausibly early 16th century object, which made it of kind of great interest to us. There are a number of in the kind of world of Holbein's portraits of sitters in Henry VIII's court, became of interest both for the artist and the sitter, and lots of sort of copies were commissioned later in the 16th and earlier in the 17th century. So, for example, our portrait of Thomas Cromwell is from that kind of later period rather than being from the mid-16th century. So it was really, we were very interested to see that it was from the wooden panel support dated from the 1530s. The one area that we were sort of had many questions about was the curtain in the background, because it was covered by a very thick varnish that had, I think the term is kind of alligated, so it had gone into this very kind of lumpy, scaly finish. And because the Vienna portrait that is so well known by Holbein has a sort of pale, has a blue background in which Jane Seymour sort of casts a shadow to create this sort of sense of three-dimensional space. We knew this curtain was sort of something different from that, instead of being just a direct replica, and so wondered if it might have been something that was added to the painting in the 17th or 18th century, because it was obscured by all this varnish. So that was the one area that we had some kind of, we knew we wanted to research further.
So I think does that take us into the restoration process and what you did to restore the painting and what you found out, in fact?
Yes, absolutely. That the first thing that we were able to find out, so you sort of document the painting using a range of techniques, for example, infrared reflectography, which reveals the sort of underdrawing beneath the surface. And actually, in this case, some of the underdrawing can still be seen on the surface as the paint layers have become more translucent. So that was one method of sort of really getting to know the painting. Unfortunately, X-radiography, which is a very classic technique to see about how paint layers have been built up in the painting, wasn't possible, didn't reveal any results, because the back of the panel is covered with a layer of red lead paint, which is the thing that sometimes people kind of painted onto the back of wooden panels, and that meant that the lead in that meant that you would only ever get just a sort of a white sheet on your X-ray, so it obscure, so you couldn't get any additional information. And also photography in UV light and photomicroscopy. So we have a wonderful microscope table at the portrait gallery to be able to take really sort of detailed images and to understand how the surface was working. And the kind of key question that we wanted to ask first was about what this kind of thick varnish that was obscuring particularly the background was made up from, and how if it might be possible to safely remove that. And so that my colleague, conservator Laura Hind, was working on treating the painting, and sort of found that it was actually much easier to remove than we had feared, and so was able to be very safely treated in that way, and to kind of uncover this really beautiful curtain in the background, which has sort of been modelled in an underlayer of grey with then green on top, and this very kind of cleverly thought out golden pattern, a kind of diaper pattern on it. So an incredibly expensive bit of material rendered in a very skillful manner, and with sort of details of the sort of gilding on the fringing down to kind of that level. So that was incredibly exciting to discover, and also that the pattern extended all the way sort of behind her, whereas it had seemed very much that it just sort of disappeared into darkness, that you couldn't quite kind of interpret what was going on, that actually it became evident that this wonderful sort of green curtain disappeared into the shadows behind her. And also at the same time in treating the painting, that the varnish that wasn't quite so thick on the kind of main body of the portrait, but when that was revealed, this wonderful rich kind of red, lustrous red of her dress, and again this very ornate, thought-out geometric pattern on her sleeves, really came to life in a very exciting way.
Gosh, what wonderful colours contrasting. I haven't been to the National Portrait Gallery to see this restored portrait yet, but it sounds amazing, and I can't wait to see it. But the colours sound incredible.
Yes, it is a really beautiful composition.
Now, you mentioned before that bits of the painting were unfinished. Why do you think that is? And also maybe the other question I have around that is, when you have a painting that is partially unfinished, can it tell you something that a fully finished painting can't, for example?
Yes, kind of absolutely. That the reason that we feel that it's unfinished is because of the areas that seem very, very simplified, and what kind of unites them. So rather than being a section of the panels, for example, kind of the lower left corner or her face, and having the sense that it's been perhaps very over-cleaned in the past, and that has perhaps lost some information, that what you can see is that it's all the areas that would be gold in her headdress, in her necklace, and in the large jewel at her bodice, because of course we can compare to the Vienna portrait to know sort of what the finished image was intended to look like. And so these are all kind of on slightly different areas of the composition, and yet they all have this very sort of rough finish, very simplified. And so what we think is that they were awaiting the moment where the artist would have put on a layer of gilding to then paint the finishing touches over the top. So you have that sort of sequence in which a painting was built up. So it's kind of waiting for that very final stage. Now, and the other area that's of great interest is in her sleeves and the forepart of her dress, which again in the Vienna portrait we can see of this very elaborate, beautiful cloth of silver, and it was made by having, again, an underlayer of silver that then you paint over the top. And what we were able to reveal during the treatment was that the sleeve on the left retained the original kind of pattern of this, probably kind of pomegranate pattern on this very luxurious textile, and that there were faint traces of silver underneath these bits of drawing. And so what that suggests is that the silver was put on the sleeve, the pattern was applied, and then at some point, because silver is very vulnerable, silver leaf, that's been lost, and only the tiny bits that were kind of trapped onto the drawing have survived. But whether it was particularly vulnerable because it had never reached a kind of final, complete layer. So that helped us to kind of understand the sleeves. And so what's particularly intriguing about this, because artists in the 16th century would be very much working in a workshop environment, that paintings were sort of team productions of different elements, and it gives you this sort of glimpse of the pragmatic stages that you go through to build up the painting. And so an artist has clearly spent a lot of time on the background and this wonderful kind of gilded pattern, and then perhaps was just about to move on to the next stage of doing the forepart and the headdress. But the sort of flesh tones had already been done, so that phase was completed, and then it was just working on these final details.
So I'm just dying to think, gosh, what happened to this poor guy?
Well, I mean, yes, that is the kind of really tantalising thing. And we don't have, because we don't know the provenance, who the original patron for this portrait was, we can only have sort of supposition. But there are a number of intriguing possibilities, one of which is that perhaps Jane's sudden death restricted sort of demand for her portraiture. But that seems less likely, because we know that her brother Edward Seymour commissioned a portrait of her and paid Holbein for it after her death. So she was still sort of the future king's mother, and very much a figure to be commemorated.
Was that the Vienna portrait by Holbein that you were talking about, or is that a different one?
A different one. We don't know. Yes, we don't know which one Edward Seymour commissioned.
Okay.
That hasn't been able to be connected. And then but then another question is whether it was commissioned by a member of the Seymour family more widely, as they wanted to sort of champion their position at court through their connection to Jane, particularly during Edward VI's reign. And then if it could perhaps have been the sort of downfall of the Seymour family in many ways during Edward's reign, that if the artist realised their patron was never going to pay the bills, and so therefore stopped. And then the kind of a third option, which is perhaps the most sort of dramatic, is that Holbein's own death was, according to sort of documentary record, seems to have been very sudden, and possibly from plague. And so you think of one thing that's going to close down an artist studio and cause everybody to just walk away from whatever they were doing. It is perhaps plague. So
Absolutely.
Whilst we don't have the thing, there is something very sort of suggestive about this portrait that's kind of so beautifully finished in so many ways, and clearly a very, very high status commission because of the effort that has gone into this almost additional compositional element to the portrait that's in Vienna. And then it's just been sort of completed to 95%, and someone then has just walked away.
Yeah. And do you feel that there is a kind of a Holbein signature to this portrait? I mean, obviously it's very similar in appearance to the Vienna portrait. Can you tell by certain elements of the way that the painting's been constructed that it could well have been from his workshop?
Well, yes. So I think the kind of closest we can get to is sort of Holbein's studio environment, because of the skill with which it's been executed, that the number of portrait painters working in England at this date was very small. It was a very kind of restricted pool. And the fact that it is so closely related to the Vienna painting in terms of its proportions suggests that they had access sort of to a source image that they could then create this painting from. There are a number of surviving portraits that seem to sort of come from this kind of studio around Holbein. And most relevant as a comparative to this portrait is the full length of Henry VIII in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, which has very similar underdrawing. And these are, again, sort of associated with Holbein's studio. There are sort of some incredibly skillful elements, but it really does seem to be part of that kind of group of works. And that output of, again, this very elite sort of royal patronage.
Well, that is fascinating. That is a real deep dive into the painting. So all that remains is for us to all to come and see it. So
absolutely. It is on display in Room 1 at the National Portrait Gallery, and it's really, really wonderful because we're able to display it next to one of the great treasures of our collection, which is the Whitehall cartoon, which is Hans Holbein's preparatory drawing of Henry VIII, which was for the Whitehall mural that was destroyed in the late 17th century. But in this huge image of Henry VIII, it was always intended to be kind of compositionally paired with an image of Jane Seymour. It was a celebration of dynasty, with having Henry VII and Henry VIII, and Elizabeth of York and Jane Seymour. And so to be able to place Jane Seymour in dialogue with the Whitehall cartoon is a really exciting moment.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about that painting today. We are most grateful.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So that was Vignon, 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 Vignette by Claude Sermisi, who I believe is a Franco-Flemish composer. And I had an email recently from a listener asking me to say a little bit more about where I get the music from. So there is a wonderful site online for free downloadable Renaissance music, and it is all recorded by John Sayles. So I will put a link in the credits on Podbean. So if you want to go and have a look at the site for yourself and maybe download some of your own Renaissance music, you will be able to do so. So that brings us to the end of October's show. I hope you've enjoyed our visit over to Wolfhall and my conversation with Charlotte Bolland about that secret life of a Renaissance painting. But before we say adieu, let me remind you of a couple of things. First of all, if you want to pack your bags and come on your own mini virtual progress, don't forget to click on the link, which I will include in the Podbean intro text. That will take you through to a place where you can sign up for the virtual 1535 progress that Natalie and I will be running online for 4 days from the 24th of October. And secondly, if you love the Tudor Travel Show and you'd like to support the show going forward and keep it on the road, then you would have my undying gratitude if you would like to become a patron of the show, and you can do so by clicking in the on the green button which is in the top right hand corner of the Tudor Travel Show Podbean homepage. And I'd just like to thank the 4 patrons so far who are supporting the show. That's Jill and Deb and Cindy and Chris. Thank you so much. So I think that's all then for today. We're going to be returning as usual in November, where I will be visiting Penshurst Place and be going on a tour of the house with one of the guides. And I'll also be talking again to Florence Evans from the Vice Gallery about a very special painting that they currently have in the gallery of Edward VI. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of the month, and all that remains for me to say as usual is happy time travelling.